What will the future role of public space be? What are the new policies that public space needs?
I think it's interesting as you were talking about this project starting as a more general investigation of public space and shifting focus in a way to try to attack or take on the changes brought about or what's been made visible by the current crisis. And I'm interested to see, I think, where it goes, because I would sort of argue that in these sort of moments of crisis, we want to respond very quickly and see how this changes everything. But I'm not so sure that this changes much at all. In the sense that I think that the questions that we would be asking and needing to answer, in February, in January, are not so different from the ones that we really need to be talking about now, and that would continue to be the questions that sort of plague us around public space in the city, next January, or even in the advent of a vaccine for the coronavirus. And I say that in the sense that, obviously there's been a trajectory with the coronavirus of this moment of, oh, it's this great equalizer to realizing how much it's really making visible, not just cracks, but, fundamental gaping holes in terms of inequality in the city, in terms of who's affected and what recourse people have, whether they're in lockdown or whether they're sick and in hospitals for adequate treatment. And I'm speaking, I should say, with the particular case of New York City in mind, which is where I'm based and also what I've studied. But I think some things are particular and some things are absolutely not there. So I'll say, and I heard about this very recently, very briefly elsewhere. One thing that I've been very struck by is things like the pandemic come along, and I think designers, one of the things that immediately happens is a desire to help and to solve and to look for solutions, right? How do we change what we do now in light of what's happening at the moment? And I've been struck by how much the photographs of Domino Park on the waterfront in Williamsburg have, where the parks managers started painting out these, spaced out circles so that people could go and be outside but be socially distanced at a safe distance. How much that particular image has been lifted up and circulating as a kind of cipher for what is public space in this moment. Both trying to point out a kind of ingenuity of adaptation, right? And that we can make this work with the sort of clever and simple moves of, do the math, parse out the space, use paint, and make it safe. And I think it's interesting how much that has resonated and connects to, other points of interest around the kind of, the hacks and the fixes that sort of, provide safety and continuity in the ways that we're used to using public space, or even, going to the restaurant with the plexiglass barrier, and can continue to do so. Looking at and thinking about and seeing this image more and more, travel and be replicated and altered. I was just writing how much in the context of New York, but again, not only, I've been thinking so much more about a very different and much more iconic and not appealing image that hasn't circulated so much, that connects to all kinds of information that we don't have about the distribution of public space and open space and parks, right? So not the distribution of people in it, but where is the space that people can take refuge in or walk and find, as everyone's been talking about, the kind of peace of being outside, comfort of access to nature, without having to, rely on access to a car or public transportation that might not feel safe. And we look so much, at this question of, okay, people are out in this park, which in this case is, a waterfront project that's tied to the redevelopment of, a very, now wealthy area of the city. And and we never see, we've not seen at all images in the media, nor very much for, among designers, although this is changing a little bit, the, what's happening, what's happening in the other parks, what happens where parks aren't. So this image that I've been thinking about is an organization mapped, precisely in the moment of coronavirus, a map of park need in the city. So really identifying where people are not within a 10-minute walk of a park or other open space, but also overlaying that with economic conditions and with incidences of coronavirus. And what you find are areas of, wonderful green in wealthy areas of the city, right, where there is ample space, and it's a question of how do you sort of make it work, and a much bigger question of distribution, where you find, large areas and communities where folks have been really hard hit by the virus. People are, perhaps in overcrowded housing conditions. People have kids that need to go outside, and there is nowhere for them to go. So I think it's really important to zoom out to that level of distribution beyond the individual park, to think about access more broadly. And that's where I was coming from with this question of, what matters now that mattered back in January that continues to matter 2 years hence. Because I think a lot of the issues around public space, and I'm certainly in this case really focused on, the provision of amenity in terms of open space, recreational space, and not so much the political dimensions, right, which are related but separate, and that we also like to conflate. That a lot of the issues are no different, in July than in April, than in March, and that what has happened is we've been able to see and be reminded of the basic function, right, of those kinds of spaces, for people to feel human, basically, and now to be able to be among others, at a safe distance without fear. We've been very much reminded of their value. That has absolutely sort of come to the fore. And then the question that automatically begs is, where is that value across the city and across incomes and across geographies? So for me, that's, really one of the fundamental issues that I think we need to grapple with, which is not just about designing coexistence at the kind of person-to-person level, but at a larger scale. There's been this rush to blame density, let's say, for the spread of coronavirus, which, we're seeing through many comparative cases isn't true, right? We're sort of assigning to space what are failures of policy, and of, policy, basically, and of enforcement. So I say I don't buy the density issue. I understand, psychologically the association, but I think again that it comes back to distribution, right? We can have density with there is more room that we can make, right? You can have density and more public open space. You can have density, and again, in the North American context, better residential construction, so that rather than squeezing every last drop of development for rentable or saleable square footage, right? There are things like courtyards and terraces that exist in other places and that can make density, also safe and habitable. So I understand it, but I think I think it's a false, it's a false equivalency. I think it gets into that sort of scarcity idea, of, oh, well, there isn't enough to go around. I don't think there isn't enough space to go around. Again, I think it's how you distribute it. So, um, what will happen in terms of trends, of people moving out to the suburbs and exurbs. I'm technically a historian, and I'm terrible at future, and would never hazard to say, but to say, are there ways that we can absolutely continue to envision and incentivize people to live in more dense settlements with the kind of features that make that safe and desirable? It's absolutely possible. I think in the last few years also, and that's certainly one interesting thing that's come out, in this moment, that questions of public health, that we weren't really talking about very much, have really come to the forefront again. That obviously, at the origins of, modern public parks and even opening up wider streets were all these questions of, of livability, in the sense of, among many other questions, health and, access to the kind of better trappings of urban citizenship. And, in the last few years, especially, there's been such a coupling of the development of new park space as amenity for luxury development, for the attraction of tourism, that connection of, where is the space and where is the need? If you recalibrate, what do you need it for? It just doesn't add up.
What will be the future role of our streets? What will be the new forms of human transportation?
In many cities, we seem to be, for better or worse, at this moment of, there's been this dramatic brief rupture, right? First of the sort of, there's nobody out on the streets. You can sail down the street in your skateboard, or, streets taken over by bicycles, people off of public transit, and now, that everywhere we're starting to see movement back out onto the street. I think that, sort of burning question of, do things go back to normal? Do things, is there an opportunity here for a new normal? And I think, again, to speak from a particularly dysfunctional place, I think, in the northern context, in terms of mobility and streets, in New York, which has always been sort of terrible on this. There's, this kind of, first of all, looking very anxiously to other cities, seeing things like the closing of streets, expansion of bike infrastructure, right? The idea of the 15-minute city, et cetera, and the sort of, on the one hand, sort of hope that, perhaps this too could be us. And I think a bit of, hope and also terror, that the window will close for those kinds of more permanent interventions. I mean, it's an incredible opportunity, right, to get cars out of dense cities and turn over that street for other forms of mobility, or right now, for other forms of sociability, like expanding restaurant space. But there's also been a really intense sort of revanchism connected to, questions of safety and fear, of coronavirus, of the other, of what's the safest place to be, right, inside the walls of your car. There was that horrible moment a couple of months ago in the US, where the CDC started issuing guidance for people to go back to their offices, and you have a national guideline saying people shouldn't take public transportation and drive in their private cars by themselves from their home to their office. So, in this moment, that's terrifying, right? And I think in this moment that there's literally no time to make transitions in terms of the use of fossil fuels and finding other patterns of mobility. you know, what the future should be is, you know, is moving people out of cars onto the street, walking, micromobility, really simple things like buses, you know. I was just reading today in New York, the surface buses have overtaken the subway for the first time in who knows when in terms of passengers, right? So there are some ways that looking back are finding these very easy solutions again to moving people around on the streets are so obvious and so you know, so promising and actually move us in a much better direction if, you know, there's the money and the political will to use this moment for the better.
What should be the role of technology and AI in rethinking the possibilities for public space? Can AI be used to control parts of the city according to unexpected events?
As definitely not exactly a Luddite, but never a sort of enthusiast of the possibilities of this technology, my immediate answers, you know, come much more from what I've seen and read in the more negative aspects, right? Questions of surveillance, questions of, you know, you can imagine so many really horrifying scenarios that, for example, coronavirus could make possible, you know, in terms of the surveillance of public space. You know, what if we could find some way to, you know, control from afar the temperature of everybody who's moving through a certain place and, like, you know, pluck them out and protect everybody. But what happens to people's rights? What happens in so many places if you don't, you know, have recourse to the rights of citizenship to defend yourself? So it's hard for me not to see all of the abuse of surveillance, you know, whether given again the sort of profound situations of inequality and exploitation that we're seeing, whether it's people who are undocumented, whether it's people who are Black and out in public space, the potentials for abuse and the lack of oversight and control is such that that I have a hard time seeing how artificial intelligence and technology improve the public realm, but I know that is a very limited view, and I'd be very curious actually, and I'm all ears for some of the directions that we could see this otherwise. I think some of the most interesting discussions that I've not paid enough attention to in this moment, and especially as so many people have kind of moved out of real public space and onto spaces like Zoom, is, you know, the opportunity to rethink the digital public sphere outside of the sort of ownership of a few companies and the sort of massive monetization of data. So I think there's really, really interesting thinking and promise in terms of those public spaces. I have less enthusiasm, but I'm all ears for the ways that AI or technology can bring a better situation to physical public spaces. What I look at there is, in this moment, that there's, you know, a confluence of you know, extreme political mobilization precisely around the sort of expansion of who's included in this public of the city, you know, which is both the racial conflict and claims of the civil rights movement in the U.S., but moving into the Black Power movement, but all kinds of social movements at that time, on the one hand, And on the other, again, a sort of similar resonance, but different in that there was more money to be spent at the time, a real fear about what is the future of the city, right? As you were sort of asking before about density, right? You know, the city is in decline, it is dangerous, it is filled with all these others. How are we going to get people, you know, especially white middle class people to stay in this city? And so at that time, there was a really interesting confluence of political interest and investment in improving the public realm, both through design and distribution. So really coming up with new uses, designs, locations for space, you know, where people could have access to recreation, but also feel themselves as part of the city and as citizens. There was a kind of brief period of really interesting experimentation. I call it the invention of public space because although we've seen, you know, throughout history, a lot of forms like the ones that are, you know, developed at that time, we're talking about things like regional and waterfront parks, but also little parks in vacant lots and pedestrianized streets and residential plazas. Thinking about all of that stuff sort of holistically as something that's called public space and that brings certain benefits to the city and citizens really sort of emerges in this moment. And it kind of combines together these different impulses that are about redevelopment and sort of keeping people in the city, but also ideas about equity and inclusion and the idea that these are really spaces that let people be and feel themselves as full citizens. Has been really powerful ever since, I think, especially for how designers think about public space and for some of the tendencies to then end up mixing up sometimes what are the political functions, what are the economic functions, what are the kind of health and recreational functions of this thing that we think that we can design that we call public space. So I look at, you know, and from this vantage point, you can look back and see really, really incredible experiments, really incredible ideas, a lot of which don't come to fruition, you know, for systems of small parks in neighborhoods that have not seen much investment for, you know, now something that feels so desperately, you know, needed and valuable, like beaches and waterfronts that would be accessible via public ferry for people who are, again, in places that don't have these things and don't have access to, you know, get in their car and go to their country house, you know, for the summer. All, again, combined with a really interesting formal and material and kind of psychological approach to kind of thinking, what is this space of the city? So all this to say that that we've sort of been here before. It's very interesting this, you know, in this moment between these questions of access to space and of course all of the protests and uprisings and, you know, out on the street in the last month, and combined with that, you know, these the sort of mobility questions that we were talking about and pedestrianization projects that sort of, again, combine all of these different ideas of, well, we need to sort of let people be out on the street, but we also need to do this because it's good for restaurants, but also, so I think we're seeing a lot of similar impulses, and it'll be interesting to see where it lands, you know, and how it's important to kind of think on both levels about, you know, the kind of spaces that are being created, but who is using them and where they're located, and also, you know, in the long run, how we account for their maintenance and preservation. So you had in the 60s and 70s this great efflorescence of all these great ideas and projects, a lot of which didn't last because we didn't pay for them to be cleaned up. And so, you know, so we find ourselves in a similar moment in some ways, where I think a lot of things that people are thinking about, again, you know, whether it's you know, working with the communities to build coronavirus safe cooling centers for the hot summer months, and these kind of temporary interventions, you know, what's the longer life that those things take on, and again, how do they sort of connect with spending and with policy? So so the book really looks at this earlier moment, but finds the seeds of, I think, some of the things that have really dogged designers and, you know, planners and city officials who want to do good things, want to make, you know, a more inclusive city through these kinds of interventions, and how difficult that can be. Which is not to say that it's impossible. I think a big part of what we can sort of learn from past experiences is, you know, is precisely to learn from them and not forget, and then sort of try again, starting from zero. But I mean, we've had experiences, we've learned things about, you know, things like budgeting for maintenance, things like finding better ways to redistribute power and work with different community partners instead of sort of showing up to, you know, make a gift. There's lots that we've learned and that we can sort of build on with the right will.